Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able, with 10,000, to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. Grace, mercy, and peace are yours from our triune God. Amen. This is one of those Sundays when I just want to put a question mark following the exclamation mark as our response to the gospel. As in, after hearing about the impossible choices and none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions, it's praise to you, O Christ? I mean, really, how much enthusiastic praise can we muster for a passage like this? It doesn't make it much easier learning that this is what is called one of the group of Jesus's hard sayings, because this one is pretty relentless. If you want to come with me, you'll need to hate your family, hate your life, give everything away, and pick up a cross. You've got to count the cost and make up your mind. You've got to decide if following me is worth it, worth everything you count on, everything that defines you, everything that makes you feel like you are in charge of your life. And so, Jesus asks, what will you choose? But wow, why does he have to say it like this? Why say all of these really unbearable things about hating parents and children and brothers and sisters and even our own lives? Ancient Near East scholars have noted that he was using a figure of speech that we don't use in these times anymore. But in that time, in that culture, the way you stated a preference was by pairing two things and saying you loved one and hated the other. It didn't have anything to do with emotions, but rather priorities. So if I said, I love the beach and I hate the forest preserve, it wouldn't mean that I was thinking and feeling that the forest preserve was the worst place on earth, but simply that the beach was my first choice, which it is. Still, it's hard for our 21st century ears and hearts to hear Jesus speak this way. And it's a hard thing to hear from Jesus in our current time frame as well, just as we're trying to figure out what the church is going to look like and be like. And as we try to find our footing as well as our witness in the wake of this pandemic. It was struggle enough just a very short time ago to decide to come together in an enclosed space, as well as decide to sing together. And I am so grateful that we are at that point, so grateful. And I continue to give thanks for the technology that keeps us connected and safe. Even so, it seems we've got enough going on with trying to encourage people to join us in this movement of grace and mercy and justice and peace called Christianity. And then we get this from Jesus this morning. It's a tense and dramatic and uncomfortable scene because it is time for the crowd to make a choice. Many were following him as much for the possibility of getting a healing or seeing a miracle as they were for the excitement of being with someone who was talking about real hope, breaking into their economic and political and religious lives. All of these were good things and all good reasons to follow him around, but Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. And it was time to get honest about what that destination would ultimately look like. No family, no friends, no belongings, just a cross, and shortly thereafter, no life. So Jesus puts it to the crowd, how will you choose? Here's what it costs to follow me. You'll need to say no to a life that convinces you to trust in your own connections, your own strength, your own willpower, and say yes to the one that puts me, cross and all, in that place. What'll it be? Dorothy Bass was the director of the Valparaiso Project on the education and formation of people in faith, an editor of a book called Practicing Our Faith, a way of life for searching people. In it, there are chapters about practices for contemporary Christians that find their roots in ancient disciplines. There are reflections and actions for things such as dying well, shaping community, singing our lives, forgiveness, and there's one that I think grabs onto these hard words of Jesus and distills them into a truth about our life with God. Saying yes and saying no. A life of discipleship, of following Jesus, will be a series of yeses and nos, of decisions and choices. And the author of that chapter, M. Sean Copeland, puts it this way. It's not always easy to choose. In order for a no to be effective, it must be placed in the larger context of a life-affirming yes. But saying yes is not always easy either. Sometimes even as the yes forms on our tongue, we pull back. Every yes calls up the unsettling potential of change in our lives. And so here's the thing. Recognizing that many who were following him still didn't understand what saying yes to choosing his way meant, Jesus tells two parables. Parables that seem as obvious as last Sunday's parable about guest lists and choosing seats. He describes two reckless protagonists, a builder who wants to build a tower but doesn't get estimates, and a king who wants to wage war against a king with a much larger army. Who are these guys? Who doesn't go out and get an estimate before taking on a major construction project? Who doesn't check out the size of the army before lobbing the first salvo? It sure sounds like Jesus was pointing out that both the builder and the king might have reconsidered their plans upon realizing the true cost, the true risk, and in that giving a heads up to the crowd that they might want to count the cost and risk of following him before heading any further down the road. But the parables lie on the page unfinished. Did the builder decide to build or not? Did the king go to war or not? After considering the sunk cost and calculating the risk, what did they do? We don't know. And Jesus doesn't say. What we do know is that the tower foundation that Jesus himself would build with his body and an uplifted cross would look for all the world like a shameful, ridicule-worthy failure. And the King, the Divine One, to whom Jesus was loyal, would not be interested in making a truce with an empire whose preferred methods for keeping peace were violence and oppression. So here's what Jesus doesn't say. If the cost is high, if the risk is great, don't do it. But instead, calculate the cost, consider the risk, and then decide. And after pondering, we might yet say yes. Yes, it's worth the cost. It's worth the risk. We might just say yes to the tower and yes to the battle. Yes to Jesus. Do I have the courage, the energy, the foresight to always decide to choose a life-giving yes or no? I wish I could say, why yes, yes I do because I love Jesus. But I don't have the self-discipline or strength or whatever it takes to choose wisely each time, and maybe you don't either. And that's when it's Jesus who has to do the life-giving thing with his ever-present yes to us, to save, to heal, to bring goodness and justice and mercy close enough to touch. This is the faith we hold fast to, that Jesus will not stop offering us the way of cross-shaped choices, as well as his way of loving us and all creation. This is the faith that we practice too, learning how, again and always, to say yes and say no, with wide-awake decisions, with open-hearted prayer, with honest relationships, with worship that transforms our perspectives and possibilities, and, beloveds, with Jesus. Amen and yes, and thanks be to God.